Welcome to the topic, Meaning in Language and Symbols. Some questions to consider for this topic are, well, let's define subtext. Why is subtext so important to the visual medium of movies? And the study of proxemics, or the study of personal space, demonstrates that the cultural use of personal space is a means of communication. Do you have a personal space story? Tell us about it. What is your personal space and how does that differ within cultures and across cultures? Give a short description of a movie you just saw using mythemes, names like woman or witch or hero, for example, Into the Woods, the movie Into the Woods. Mythemes, another name for mythemes is probably archetypes. So let's talk about that. In this lecturette, I plan to discuss the basic elements of language from an anthropological perspective. Anthropologists study language use cross-culturally through time and how language is deeply rooted in cultural meaning. We also explore communication as a nonverbal practice and as a practice of narrative structure, the ways in which we tell stories. Our specific learning objectives for this lecturette segment on language and meaning will be to answer what makes language different from other forms of communication, to examine how anthropologists and linguists study language in general and specific languages, to answer how languages change over short and long periods, and to discuss discourse and subtext in films. This week we have some keywords and key concepts. The words in bold that are small are in the book glossary. Key concepts are in capitals. We also have some words that aren't in the course glossary that I'm going to go over in this lecturette video. And define those in our lecturette video that are not in the book. So this lecturette is particularly important to watch and learn. Let's answer the basic question first. What is language? Language is the primary means of communication, whether spoken or written, for us humans. It's transmitted through learning as part of enculturation. We hear about the mother's tongue, for instance. There's good reason why we call it mother's tongue. Our mother's speech is the first speech we normally hear as very small children when we're suckling on the breasts of our mothers. It's based on arbitrary learned associations between words and the things they represent. Very importantly, though, language is something we have to learn when we're very young. We have the architecture in our minds to know what language is, but we have to hear it. We have to interpret it very young, or we may never learn languages. Languages allow humans to conjure up elaborate images, discuss the past and future, and share knowledges, share experience with others, benefit from others' experience. Anthropologists study language in its social and cultural context. More importantly, I think language really is the primary way by which humans evolved, and our neurology shows that the use of language really informed the way our brain actually formed when in our early evolutionary past. One of the most important things to realize about communication is that Homo sapiens are not the only species that communicates. Chimpanzees communicate with call systems, which are communication systems of non-human primates, the great apes in other words, that use a limited number of sounds produced in response to specific stimuli. Monkeys also make calls as well, although they're a little bit less complex than apes. They're automatic and cannot be combined. At some point in human development, our ancestors began to combine calls and to understand combinations. More recent experiments show that apes can learn to use, if not speak, true language. It's been shown that they can speak certain words fairly closely. Washu, a chimpanzee, eventually acquired a vocabulary more than 100 American sign language signs, and she began to combine signs into rudimentary sentences. Lucy, another chimpanzee, lived in a foster family and used ASL to converse with her foster parents. Chimpanzees and some gorillas even have been shown to learn ASL or sign language very well. It's important to realize too that even dogs can recognize certain things about our language. For instance, the way we point to things because of their evolution, their last 10,000 years of evolution from the original wolves, dogs, even in that small amount of time, which is comparatively small, have learned to identify where we're trying to indicate for them. And some parrots rather, and other birds can learn to identify language, elements of certain languages. But really, it's about non-human primate communication that we learn that how closely and how communication evolved in Homo sapiens. Now, cultural transmission is the process by which basic language is transmitted through learning. Washu, Lucy, and others have tried to teach ASL to other animals, which is also very interesting. They try to become teachers of other animals, and this is really important to understanding that human beings are innately teachers of language to others. Now, there are some elements of language that we've identified through the years and defined. Phonology is the study of the sounds of language. A phoneme is the basic unit of sound, and we'll talk about those more later and give you some examples. Morphology is the study of how phonemes, sounds, combine to form language. And semantics is the study of meaning in language, the study of the arrangement of both language, sound, and meaning. A morpheme is one or more phonemes to create sound and meaning, or what we would say is a syllable. Syntax is regular grammar patterns and rules that speakers use to form words into strings of words, and discourse analysis. Now, if you've studied a foreign language, you know that foreign languages tend to have different syntax than the English language. Adjectives come before nouns or after nouns, etc. That's different from English. Another fieldwork technique we use is discourse analysis. As anthropologists, we talked about fieldwork in our last topic, but discourse analysis we also use, particularly media anthropologists like me. And this is defined as the analysis of the ways in which people actually speak, looking for rules and characteristics that convey thoughts and emotions through diverse forms of expressions. We look at oral traditions. In many tribal societies, stories were never written down, and oral folkloric traditions convey cultural knowledge that can be very old or ancient, thematically persistent, and continually recomposed in new and creative ways to say something new about the current social situations in society. Think about this. Almost so many cultures around the world have a flood myth as part of their genesis or part of their origin myths. I think that comes from maybe an era 10,000 years ago, an oral tradition that's persisted all that time and has been around. That's how persistent oral traditions can be. Anthropologists also study nonverbal communication, which is full of emblems, which are discrete gestures with specific meaning that can be used without speech, and other gestures like that. We see Rhiannon here in this picture giving the peace sign. Proxemics, personal spaces communication. I'll give you one example, though, where emblems can be very dangerous and they're culturally specific. Now, Rhiannon's saying this, which is peace, of course. Turn this around in Great Britain like this, and that's like giving somebody the middle finger. So don't do this in Great Britain. Do this, however. Language also is composed, or was thought to be composed at one time with a universal grammar, that there was a biological basis of language. And Noam Chomsky proposed a species-wide universal grammar that languages have subjects, verbs, and objects to study the structure for communication. We now know that human beings have the biological, neurological capabilities for language, but we don't necessarily believe we have a universal grammar embedded in our minds. It takes really a very early nurturing stage to come up with that. But we've had this universal grammar concept around. It's largely discredited, but Noam Chomsky has gone on to become one of the great analysts of discourse and propaganda, and we'll talk about that much later when we get to media and art. A subfield within linguistics and anthropology is the field of sociolinguistics, which investigates the relationship between social and linguistic variation, or language in its social context. This subdiscipline focuses on features that vary systemically with social position and situation. And I have to point out that linguistic change does not occur in a vacuum, but in society, and this is what sociolinguistics points out. Sociolinguistics looks at gendered language or nonverbal cues and relationships, relational topics within a community that regard gender in a certain way or point to gender in the language structure. Sociolinguistics studies language status and power and status and roles in a society. A good example of that, of course, is when in Spanish you use tú instead of usted, which connotes familiarity. Language also is the single most important means to both form identity and be identified as a modern human being. But we also create new meanings and create new slang, and we're creating new languages all the time. A good example of that is Californication, which is a term derived from bumper stickers frequently seen on cars in the state of Oregon during the 1970s and early 1980s. The sticker said, "Don't Californicate Oregon." Well, that word later went on to be used in other ways and became a television series at one point. What I'd like to do during our discussion sessions is talk about new slang that you've heard. Come up with some words for us to talk about, give them context, and we'll go over that when we talk. From time to time, I'll reintroduce you to some of the theory that we learned in our theory and fieldwork topic. So this week, what I'd like to do is reintroduce you to this idea of structuralism, and one of the ways it's used by an anthropologist named Lévi-Strauss. Now, Lévi-Strauss identified myths as a type of speech through which a language could be discovered. His work is called the Structuralist Theory of Mythology, which attempted to explain how seemingly fantastical and arbitrary tales could be so similar across cultures. Because he believed that there was not one authentic version of a myth, rather that they were all manifestations of the same language, he sought to find the fundamental units of myth, namely the mytheme, or general theme that represented one myth. Oedipus, for example, consists of the psychological overrating expectations of blood relations and the downside tragic underrating of blood relations, etc. By Lévi-Strauss's definition, then, every movie plot can be reduced down to one of only 37 stories or mythological archetypes. Now, some film theorists have even reduced that to 10 or even 20 plots. Now, every movie is part of one of these reduced, simplified oppositions in plot and opposition. To give you an example, the movie Gone with the Wind, the movie The Magnificent Ambersons, the play Titus Andronicus, the movie Goodfellas, are all falls from the high and mighty to the dregs of lowered social class or status. This is the prevalent myth theme here that connects all of these particular dramas. Le film, language in film, discourse. Yo, I'm talking about meaning. So let's talk about discourse analysis in films really quickly. There's a couple of clips here. I'd like you to go to the Video and Web Links book on our Moodle site and watch these clips from Last Year at Marienbad, A Discourse About an Alternative Present, and Goodfellas, and the vernacular of Goodfellas English. Pause this lecturette video and go to those, and we'll come right back and I'll talk to you about them. Now, you may have noticed in Last Year at Marienbad that the narrative of the film was reduced to he or she. Now, this comes from the tradition, the movie itself, from the new novel in the early 60s, which reduced the subjects of the stories and their identities to myth themes. It was a very different way of writing, which created basically the simplified movies to the very architecture of plot and of person. We also saw Goodfellas and the vernacular of Goodfellas English, with such phrases as, "You're busting my balls." So what does this mean? How do we create these different languages? What does it say about the culture we're living in, whether it's a tough guy culture, etc.? All over the United States, we have different vernaculars that we use every day. Now, tacit meanings in visual forms can be converted into subtext. Subtext is meaning without words, visual clues and insights to a character's inner thoughts and feelings. So how do we express subtext in film? Subtext is the context of a film or play expressed by a character's actions. It is information gathered without an explicit narrative that becomes understood by the observer by observing the implicit clues. So let's pause here and watch a little clip from Jesse's doll in Toy Story. And keep in mind that the only clues that you're getting, and you're not getting a voiceover narrative for what's happening in this scene, there's a little bit of a hint through the song and the song lyrics, but the information you're gathering is all visual. Now I'd like to give you another big theory here to consider, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Comes from two men, of course, named Sapir and Whorf. The principle of linguistic relativity holds that the structure of a language helps to determine the ways in which its respective speakers conceptualize their world, that is, their worldview. Popularly known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, the principle is often defined as having two versions. In the strong version, language determinism is the idea that language directly determines thought and that linguistic categories limit and determine cognitive categories. People's perceptions of the world are filtered through the structure of their language, primarily by their language. So when and how we speak and the language we use creates our meaning and identity for us. The weaker version of this idea, of what Carl Hyder and others refer to as linguistic relativity, is the idea that linguistic categories and usage reflect cultural thought and certain kinds of human enculturated behavior, but only in a softer version. So the term Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is a bit of a misnomer, however, since Edward Sapir and Benjamin Lee Whorf never really co-authored anything, never stated their ideas in terms of a hypothesis. They worked together, however, undertaking advanced linguistic analysis of the Southwest native peoples, and others after them, other theorists after them, and researchers named this idea of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis after their whole body of work. Now, mainstream Americans evaluate the speech of low status groups negatively. So language can have something to do with stratification and our status in society, as William Labov pointed out. That pronunciation is clearly associated with prestige, and speech habits help determine how others evaluate us and thus also determine our access to employment and other resources. Pierre Bourdieu, an anthropologist, looked at linguistic practices as symbolic capital that properly trained people convert into economic and social capital. Now, you can imagine that if you're in Great Britain and you have an Oxford accent, that you have access to other areas of employment that maybe others with an East London accent may not have. Now, Labov looked at the pronunciation of R in New York City in department stores, and when he indicated that cheaper department stores basically, more people were dropping R from their pronunciation. When they would say words like floor, for instance, instead of floor, they would say floor, or flow, which indicated basically that they were lower status and they were more like city folks without education. This denoted their status. This would be a good time to take a short break before we get on to the next Lecturette segment. Our specific learning objectives for this Lecturette segment on language archaeology are to orient ourselves to the roots of Indo-European languages, to overview Maya languages, their roots, morphology, and imprinted glyphs. Now you notice I said Maya and not Mayan languages. That's because in Maya languages, it would be more proper to say Maya instead of Mayan. To explore themes of current Maya dramas. Yes, the Maya are writing drama, and they have been writing drama since the 1400s. and to overview Snat-Zipa-Home, the House of the Writer, and watch a promotional film for Snat-Zipa-Home. Now, all societies have vocabularies that are sufficient for their own needs. And an example of this is the Maya have about 20 words or so for corn. Since they grow corn, and corn is where corn came from was that area of the world in Mesoamerica. And so there are different types of corn that were very necessary for them to name. Yet there's no native name for whale for Maya, for instance, because they don't really come in contact with a lot of whales. Now, English, modern US and world society, in our modern world society has over 250,000 words, 10% of which are non-Western loan words. We use and borrow loan words from all kinds of languages where we can. Hurricane, for instance, is a loan word from Caribbean societies. Language grammars can be very complex, even in primitive societies. I want to give you a real quick glimpse, though, of language describing history and cultural history here. If you look at this small chart, you can see that there's some dates: 2000, 1000, and 0. These are all millenniums. So 2000 is 2000 BCE, 1000 BCE, 0 is, and then 1000 is 1000 CE, or a common era. What you'll notice is that right around 1500 BCE, there is one Proto-Mayan language, which denotes probably the fact that tribal people were coming into the area where the Maya now live, and they all spoke basically the same language. As they started to create villages in different cities, they created language centers from 1000 to 0 BC, language centers of power where their language started to differentiate. Then you'll notice that right around 900 CE, there were about a dozen different Maya languages, and those languages correspond to the big city-states of the Maya. After 900 CE, the Mayan dispersed into small villages, and you see a differentiation then of many different, and a division of many different Mayan languages from there on to 29 to 31 different Mayan language groups, and that's where we are now. There's about 29 extant Mayan languages. Now, what's interesting about our own English language is that it comes from and traces itself back to a very early proto-language, and most of the languages of Europe come from this same proto-language, as well as Hindi in India and other languages in the Euro-Asia area. This probably means that there was a horse culture at one point that spread this early Indo-European language around the Mediterranean, through India, even into the Asia Minor and all over Europe. We probably trace that back to about 1500 BCE or even before. So this family tree is of the Indo-European languages. All can be traced back to a proto-language. Proto-Indo-European, PIE, splits into dialects that eventually evolved into separate daughter languages, which in turn evolved into granddaughter languages such as Latin and Proto-Germanic, which are ancestral to dozens of modern languages. Now I have a little pointer here. I'll try to point out where English is, which is on this little branch. English is probably closest to Frisian and the Germanic language. The languages of Britain are down here. Gallic, Cornish, and Irish, these are all the Gaelic languages. These are the Mediterranean languages here. So they're all part, though, of the same rootstock: Greek, Sanskrit, the proto-language of Hindi. We're all part of the same language group, denoting that at one point we all came, basically, we got our language from the same extended tribe of people. Now, I want to give you an example of a very different syntax. Syntax is grammar rules, the order in which we put our words. The order to read Maya glyphs, for instance, is not as straightforward as it would seem, since glyph blocks are arranged in a grid, One would think that the reading order is either in columns or in rows. In reality, Maya glyphs are read in paired columns, meaning that the first glyph block is at the top of the left, the second is immediately on the right of the first, and the third is under the first, the fourth under the second, and so forth. This yields a zigzagging reading order. One of the reasons for that is because the Mayans had phonemes, but they also created morphemes or word pairs that were really important to put in paired columns. So let me show you how the reading order goes basically. In order to read this stele, then, you would go from A1 to B1, A2 to B2, and you'd go down to the bottom, A4 to B4, and then you'd go up to C1 to D1. That would be one word morpheme or pair, and C2 to D2. Now I'd like to show you some Maya writing with phonemes and morphemes, sound units and syllables. Ancient Maya languages are written mostly in morphemes and some phonemes. See if you can distinguish sound units from syllables in the glyphs. So let me get my little pointer here. Here you have the word for dog. So you have the phoneme here, tsu, and the phoneme ku, or phoneme ul rather. So you have an entire morpheme or syllable that is sounded like tsu'ul. You also have another morpheme here with two phonemes. You have z and z and b. So you have writing z b. Now this is a little glottal stop. What you'll notice too that's really interesting, this looks like a little painter's brush and a palette. That's because for Mayans, writing and art are the same thing. That says something about the language, doesn't it? It says something about the meaning of writing for Mayans, which is that it is both writing, is both art and writing and communication. Here's the final morpheme we'll go over. We have lots of phonemes here. We have a, la, and put it together, and we have ba'alam, which is the word for jaguar. And you'll notice here there's a little claw that denotes the jaguar. Now, the contemporary Mayans are going through a little bit of a renaissance right now, converting a lot of their old folk tales to modern media, and that's one of the things I've studied. Mayan plays today and that are being written. So these are Mayan plays that come from the book Monkey Business Theater, and the play title is here: Loafer and the Buzzard, Who Believes in Spooks, Deadly Inheritance, Jaguar Dynasty. And here's the thematic subtext of these plays. The Loafer and the Buzzard, for instance, is a traditional Native American tale that's it's basically a pan-Native American tale. It talks about arrogance and hard working and cleverness is the theme. And what I've done in my research is underscored the values, the social values that this talks about. For instance, the Loafer and the Buzzard is about the triumph of the clever and hardworking over the lazy and the arrogant. Now, arrogance is a true vice for the Mayan. Who Believes in Spooks is about spirits, lust, and fear of the unknown. And the values that are underscored are those blinded with lust are doomed. Elders have power over evildoers. Jaguar Dynasty, a story that comes from the Mayan roots and origination myths, is about cultural remembrance, revitalization, colonial evils, and power and unification. And the social values underscored through this, the meaning of these language and these folk tales is about forsaking ancestral gods, and justice brings destruction and peril. So every culture needs continuity. So take a look at these if you want a little bit further, and I'll go ahead and move on through the lecturette video. To conclude this week, what I'd like to just say is that when languages disappear, cultural diversity is reduced. So K. David Harrison states that, as another researcher, linguist, states that indigenous languages go extinct as often as every 2 weeks as its last speakers die. Now, this means that our cultural diversity, our understanding of the botany of the world, our understanding of what native plants do, the native geographies are, the meanings of these that die with the native speakers themselves. Of approximately 7,000 remaining languages, some 20% are endangered, and we need to preserve these.